You cancel the plans, you feel the slightest lift in your chest, and then immediately you wonder if something is wrong with you. Not because anything bad happened, not because you're upset with anyone, just because being alone felt like something you actually wanted. And somewhere along the way, you learned that wanting that is something that needs to be explained. If that moment feels familiar, there may be something worth understanding here. Because that quiet preference isn't a flaw in your social wiring, it might be something closer to the opposite. People who genuinely enjoy solitude are often misread by others and sometimes by themselves. The assumption is that they're withdrawing, that something is missing, that they're avoiding the world because they can't quite handle it. But that framing almost always gets it backwards. Enjoying solitude and tolerating loneliness are two completely different psychological experiences. One is chosen, one is endured. The confusion between them is where most of the shame comes from. Some people spend time alone because they have to. Others spend time alone because when they do, something inside them settles, the noise quiets, the internal world becomes accessible again. And that distinction matters more than most psychology content ever bothers to explain. Here's one way to think about it. Attention is a resource, and for some people, social environments draw heavily on that resource, not because those environments are bad, but because they require continuous monitoring. Tone, body language, unspoken dynamics, conversational timing. The brain is tracking a lot simultaneously. For people whose inner world is rich and self-directed, that constant external tracking can feel less like connection and more like sustained effort. Alone, that monitoring softens, and what's left is something they actually trust, their own thoughts, their own rhythm, their own sense of what matters. This is sometimes connected to what psychologists call a stronger internal locus of identity. The sense of who you are doesn't depend as heavily on being reflected back by others. It exists somewhat independently, which means silence doesn't threaten it. Silence actually gives it room. Think about the last time you spent a whole evening alone and felt genuinely okay, not resigned, not killing time, actually okay. That feeling isn't apathy. It's a kind of self-sufficiency that doesn't get talked about enough because our culture tends to treat it as something to fix rather than something to understand. Quick question before we continue. When you spend time alone, what is your most honest experience? A, I feel settled and restored. B, I feel fine but eventually get restless. C, I feel okay at first but then uncomfortable. D, I usually feel lonely even if I chose to be alone. There's no right answer, but your honest answer tells you something. But here's the part most people miss. Enjoying solitude doesn't mean a person doesn't care about others. In fact, people who are comfortable alone often show up in their relationships with more presence because they're not depleted when they arrive. They've had time to actually return to themselves, to process the week, to figure out what they think and feel, rather than outsourcing that process to constant social input. The version of you that's been alone for a few hours is often more patient, more honest, more genuinely attentive than the version that's been surrounded by people all day with no space to breathe. There's also a developmental thread worth naming. For some people, solitude became psychologically important early. Maybe the home environment was unpredictable. Maybe social situations felt hard to read. Maybe being alone was the one space where there were no wrong answers, no shifting expectations, just a quiet room and a sense of control over the internal climate. The preference that formed in those years doesn't disappear, it deepens, and by adulthood, solitude isn't just a preference, it can function as emotional regulation, a way of lowering the volume when the world gets too loud, a way of returning to baseline without needing anyone else to get you there. That's not isolation, that's a nervous system that learned to self-restore. The behavior looks different at different life stages too. A teenager who prefers being alone can appear withdrawn or antisocial. A 40-year-old who prefers the same thing is often called grounded, focused, self-aware. The behavior is almost identical. What changed is the frame around it. And that shift is worth sitting with, because a lot of adults are still carrying the early version of the frame, the one that said this preference was a problem, that it needed justification, that being okay alone meant something was missing in them. Most of the time, nothing was missing. They just had a quieter way of being present in their own life. If you're someone who genuinely enjoys solitude, not as a retreat from pain, but as a chosen state, that's not a personality defect. It's not avoidance. It's not emotional unavailability dressed up as independence. It may simply be how your mind does its best work, how your sense of self stays intact, how you take care of yourself without outsourcing the process. You don't owe anyone an explanation for needing quiet. You don't have to apologize for feeling restored by it. The lift you feel when the plans cancel, that's not callousness. That's your nervous system exhaling. Do you actually enjoy being alone, or does silence still make you a little uncomfortable? Let me know in the comments. I'd genuinely be curious to read your experience.